Hello everyone, Soprano Theories here, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to another video. Before we get started, be sure to click subscribe and click the bell to get notifications on all upcoming Sopranos videos. And be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, the links will be in the description below. When I made my video a few months back about the worst possible episode of The Sopranos, many of you mentioned how you believed that if there was to be a worst episode in the series, it would either be between In Camelot, which is notorious for the cringy singing of Fran Felstein, and the uninteresting storyline and plot of the 10th episode of Season 1, A Hit is a Hit. And after rewatching A Hit is a Hit for this video and analyzing it thoroughly, I cannot agree more with those of you who suggested it in your comments that A Hit is a Hit is the worst single episode of The Sopranos. And that is why in this video I will be discussing why A Hit is a Hit was a complete fail of an episode in The Sopranos' legendary log. Much like all Sopranos episodes, the episode itself centers around three major storylines. The first being Tony and his relationship with normal citizens or wonder-bred wops like his neighbor, Dr. Cusimano, which results in Tony feeling used later in the episode. The second is Christopher, Adriana, and newly acquainted musician, Massive Genius, to try and tackle the notion of visiting day, making their way onto mainstream media. And the third and final storyline of this episode, which seriously dampens the episode, is the ongoing legal dispute between Massive Genius and his crew suing Hesh over the Little Jimmy Willis copyrights to his songs that Hesh produced during the 1950s and 60s, which saw Hesh rip off these young black artists for songwriting credits. To begin, the episode starts with Paulie and Big Pussy murdering and robbing a Mexican gang of some sort that results in Tony's crew pulling off a massive score. We then cut to Tony thanking his neighbor, Dr. Cusimano, for recommending Dr. Melfi to Tony, as Tony thanks him by treating him to some Monte Cristo cigars that are technically illegal. We see during this exchange that this is the beginning of Tony and Cuz's bizarre relationship. Using his share of the score, Christopher decides to treat Adriana to dinner and a show at Le Cirque in New York City. After the show, Christopher and Adriana decide to go for a burger, where they run into the main protagonist and focus of this episode, gangster rapper Massive Genius. Now, before we dive further into this analyzation, let's talk about Massive Genius. He is clearly the sole focus of this episode and is one of the many reasons why this episode is so highly criticized by Soprano fans. He brings up the Little Jimmy Willis copyright claims to some of the songs that Hesh produced during the 1950s and 60s. A visit to Genius's luxurious mansion and a red dot to the chest later, Christopher sets up a sit-down between Tony's crew and Genius's crew that we'll later see in the episode. There's just something about Genius that gets under the skin of Sopranos fans. Bokeem Woodbine does a phenomenal job as playing Massive Genius, but whether it's his tacky suits that feature clown-colored dress shirts underneath, his ridiculous top hats, or his ongoing pursuit to try and settle the lawsuit that is almost 50 years old, that doesn't necessarily relate to himself entirely, Massive Genius is the clear problem with this episode. After his first introduction to Massive Genius, we can see that this is the beginning of Christopher's resentfulness towards Tony and the secrecy of the Italian mafia, as we later see this in Season 6 with Christopher almost confessing to everything with JT Dolan. By being impressed by the glitz and glamour of Massive Genius, Christopher sides with Adriana by using what is most likely a decent enough share of his profits from the score on her dream to pursue the music industry. It's here where we are first introduced to Visiting Day. While their music may be horrible in the eyes of Hesh, after rewatching this episode so many times, it is somewhat catchy. The short screen time of Visiting Day is some of the best parts of this episode, as the scenarios surrounding their recording sessions and listening to their audio tracks result in some hilarious quotes and memorable moments throughout the series. During this time in the series, Tony and Dr. Melfi are still trying to figure out each other, as we saw earlier with Tony thanking Dr. Cusimano for recommending Dr. Melfi. And while going for dinner at the Cusimanos, we can see that Dr. Melfi is sticking up for Tony when she states that she likes Moreno glass when everyone else is making fun of the Soprano home and their lifestyle of how their husband and father and Tony makes a living. As the episode progresses, we see more Visiting Day performances. It's clear as day that Massive Genius is using Christopher, Adriana, and Visiting Day for their money, and also trying to get with Adriana. It is during this scene where the episode continues to flop, in my opinion. While we see a few more scenes involving Visiting Day that provide some comedic relief, the plot just becomes increasingly boring and unengaging towards the audience. as Carmela is introduced to the stock market thanks to the high-class American wives, and Tony is introduced to wannabes, guys who view Tony in a different way, and obviously which they should because he's a mob boss like we see at the barbecue, and in some cases these men are dorks. Nowhere is this more evident than in Tony's golf scene. Here, Tony is bombarded with senseless questions, such as how real was The Godfather, stating Umberto's, a well-known mob brand restaurant, stating that he probably knew Carmine Galante, who is notoriously known for the infamous photo of him lying dead at the back of a restaurant, with a cigar hanging out of his mouth. But the most idiotic question has to be when one of Kuz's friends asked Tony if he knew John Gotti. Even before this question, the behavior of Kuz's friends was getting under the skin of Tony. And when this ludicrous of a question came up, it was the tipping point for Tony, as he played along with the guys and played them for the suckers that they really are. The episode closes with Hesh and Christopher debating one another over visiting day, and we discover how Tony truly felt when playing a round of golf with Kuz and his friends. Tony tells Dr. Melfi that he felt used and almost was there as a sense of enjoyment, possibly so that Kuz and his friends could say to themselves, or any of their friends for that matter, that they played a round of golf with a mafia boss. We later learn that Massive Genius is planning on suing Hesh over the copyright claims of Little Jimmy Willis, and we learn a bit more about his character and his upbringing. The episode itself does provide some intriguing backstory from the character of Hesh, as we learn how he made a living and what made him so wealthy in the first place. By all means, I don't hate A Hit is a Hit, as I simply can't hate any episode of The Sopranos' legendary log. However, it's not my favorite, as the plot doesn't do much to add any significance to the overall progression of the series, as nothing from this episode gets brought up later on in the series. The scenario of Hesh ripping off young black artists for their royalties was a real thing in the everyday world. And what David Chase did in this episode was to highlight this ongoing issue by giving it some mainstream media attention in The Sopranos. Hesh built his empire on the livelihoods of black talent, and you can actually see the guilt of Hesh eating at him in this episode. Remember, this guy only dates black women, his glory days are fixed in that Motown era world, and when he's looking around in his house with the pictures of him in his prime, it's all pictures of Hesh surrounded by black people, as he owes the black music industry his life and his wealth, as they are the sole providers for his success. This also parallels the whole thing with Tony looking for acceptance from Cusimano and the Wonder Bread Wops. While they just want the vicarious thrill of his edgy mob stories, and yet they still look down on Tony. When looking at the overall storyline and plot of this episode, nothing gets answered later on in the series. We never truly find out anything that came about from this episode, and when it comes to Tony and his relationship with Dr. Cusimano, we never really see the two connect and kindle the way they did in this episode ever again in this series. And we never find out what was in the box that Tony gave him to hold onto for a little while, a obvious reference to The Godfather. When it comes to Christopher, Adriana, Visiting Day, and Massive Genius's push to make Visiting Day a household name, sure, we see that their attempt failed miserably, but we never see the end result. Just like Adriana said, just because Hesh said Visiting Day wasn't good, didn't mean that there wasn't an audience out there for them. And then there's the lawsuit between Massive Genius and Hesh. While we find out in the episode's ending that Massive Genius is planning on suing Hesh over the copyright claims of Little Jimmy Willis, we never find out the settlement of the lawsuit or see the two sides in court for that matter. After all, it would have been interesting to see a mob boss like Tony Soprano visit a courtroom, even if it was just for a friend like Hesh. As the only question or storyline that we get an answer to is the strange loud noise that Dr. Melfi heard coming from the Soprano home. When looking back on this episode, there's so many more storylines that the writers could have added that would have enhanced the Hit is a Hit lackluster storyline opposed to its initial flop of an episode. For starters, we could have saw Dr. Cusimano open the box that Tony gave him, and when it comes to the failed music attempt by Adriana and Christopher, we could have saw them try a different record label, or even just see Adriana continue to pursue a passion of hers after Christopher spent all that money on the designer wardrobe he picked out for her. And while yes, Massive Genius clearly wanted into the pants of Adriana, and Christopher clearly knew this, what would have been a thrill to see in this episode would have been Christopher killing the so-called gangster rapper over wanting his girlfriend. And finally, when it comes to the lawsuit, a simple scene of the two sides appearing in court would have been fantastic. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to click like and let me know your thoughts about A Hit is a Hit in the comment section below. For more Sopranos content, keep it locked here, right here on this channel.